Hello and welcome to part 4 of the Social Inclusion Audit training session. So this session will focus on the indicator of intentionality. And as I mentioned before, this is a very large section. And in fact, there are 7 of the 12 questions in the audit are attributed to this indicator in particular. So let me refresh your memory about what the indicator of intentionality is. The indicator of intentionality is how the organization continues this work. It's the degree in which the organization reinforces the principles of inclusion in the short and the long term. So as examples that I mentioned earlier, the annual completion of a social inclusion audit demonstrates intentionality. So does the consistent development, implementation, and evaluation of strategies, policies, procedures. That demonstrates intentionality as well. So let's go through some of the questions. So as I mentioned, this area reflects 7 of the 12 questions. And really, if you see the slide here, what we're saying is that this is important to keep the topic of inclusion on the table, to consistently integrate it with the strategic and operational framework of an organization. Because after all, social inclusion does take time. It takes time to explore, view, challenge these values and behaviors that an organization has. It takes time to adapt policies and procedures, to train staff, to evaluate your work, and to refine your work. So let's dive into the questions. Question 3. Question 3 states, removing barriers to inclusion is made explicit in the organization's strategic plan, goals, policies, planning documents, and are articulated in the mission and vision statement. Within the toolkit, you'll find exercises such as strategic infrastructure thought starters and how to amend an infrastructure plan. So for example, in terms of thought starters, some of the questions we have included here is, do the mission and vision statement reflect the focus on social inclusion? What policies should be amended? What are the benefits of becoming more inclusive? Question 4. The organization has an active joint team of managers and non-managers that are dedicated to assessing and addressing barriers to inclusion and has incorporated removing barriers to inclusion into policy, service planning structures within the organization. There are 3 exercises within the toolkit, as well as quite a few examples in this section. And the 3 exercises include assessing staff engagement, inspiring fair access, and fair access planning. So for example, in terms of assessing staff engagement, some of the questions that you can look into are in the toolkit. For example, are staff and board members included in discussions to remove barriers to inclusion? Are staff encouraged to provide feedback on the organization's plans and social inclusion work? In terms of inspiring fair access, what this section really looks at is looking at service availability, service use, service relevance and responsiveness, and the quality of services from a fair access perspective. So let's move to question 5. Question 5. The internal team has developed and is currently using a group with majority representation from the targeted community to assist with removing barriers to inclusion by informing and guiding this work. The toolkit exercises include steps to develop community partnerships, and we've also provided all of the information from the social inclusion pilot study that we conducted with the 4 libraries looking at new immigrant youth. In particular, we've used the exercises, we've included the agendas, and the surveys, which include the focus group survey, as well as a clipboard walk-around survey that we developed to solicit the perspectives of new immigrant youth about the level of inclusion and exclusion that a library may have. Question 6. A plan of action has been developed that includes an analysis of community needs and gaps in service, results of the annual social inclusion audit, targeted strategies for governance, HR, training and learning, communication and outreach, programs and services, resources and collections development, implementation, and evaluation. This is a large question and includes quite a bit, and you could be looking at improving your status and progress in this question for quite some time. Now you probably can see why we're looking at having intentionality as a separate indicator with a series of questions, because this really is the core of this work. The toolkit exercises include understanding needs and gaps of your community, how to process your audit results, and how to assess and develop strategies for governance, HR, training, programs, and services. Question 7. The organization has regular training and learning initiatives and discussions with the staff teams and external stakeholders on methods to remove barriers to inclusion for the community and to increase the degree of cultural competency and inclusionary practices internally. So this is a large area. There are 2 examples, but there are quite a few case studies and examples within the toolkit on how to develop an inclusion training plan. And most important for this work is that training is provided that fits the culture of the organization and its mandate. So for example, health organizations, nonprofits, might be more interested in looking at this work from a cultural competency angle. There's a lot of training programs that provide that. A social service or community service perhaps might look to social inclusion from the perspective of anti-oppression. The toolkit will provide some links as well as some examples on training programs. Question 8. With community input and participation, the organization has developed and implemented various targeted community outreach and communication plans to introduce and promote the organization and its services to the community or community groups. In this question, in this toolkit, this question has a series of exercises. For example, this section focuses on understanding barriers, understanding institutional barriers, personal and social barriers, perceptions and awareness barriers, and environmental barriers. So for example, looking at examining power and authority as a barrier will help to examine the potential barriers to inclusion. Transportation, the physical environment, the lack of contact or sense of isolation that your service recipients might have are all barriers to inclusion. These exercises will help get to allow you to understand the barriers a little bit more so that you can work with your target groups to help remove those barriers to inclusion. Question 9. The organization has established financial resources within this year's fiscal budget to implement the action plan. In particular, the organization has set a budget for training, learning, communications and outreach, programs and services, and resources or collections development. This toolkit will provide you with examples in this area on how a sample budget might look like. There are a series of budget categories and budget lines for you to look at, as well as the sample budget that CULC used, the Canadian Urban Libraries Council used for the social inclusion budget. That concludes part 4. Stay tuned to part 5 when we talk about the indicator of inclusion.